Right, good evening everybody, and we're back here live again at the wonderful Nanteos mansion near Aberystwyth, and this is the second to last of our series of talks about the Dipping Pool and the Shadow of Nanteos, the Nanteos novels as we're calling them, and there's a different format tonight because I'm very, very privileged to be joined by Inger Fullerlove, who until a matter of weeks ago was manager at Aberystwyth's Waterstones, and I've known Inger for several years now, and she's very dynamic as a manager at Waterstones, very forward thinking, run a very exciting programme with writers, not just local writers but anybody she was prepared to lure to her shop and was prepared to come, and I've heard her anything to sell a book, and I've heard her give a lot of different writers a grilling and make them quake in their boots, and being a bit of a masochist, I fancied a bit of the same thing myself, so I invited her to come and talk to me rather than me give a lecture. It's a question and answer session. She's also run a very successful, for many years, and the take-up has been excellent, a book group. So again, I've been part of that book group over the last year or so, and just heard Inger talking about books in great detail and in a very profound way. So looking forward to hearing what she does with me tonight. So fingers crossed. Also, thank you very much to Hannah Jones from Nanteos for filming live on Instagram, and for Jeremy for putting it live on Facebook. So over to Inger.
Hi. Well, my very first question to you is, what do you feel is strongest in driving your plot? Is it the characters or the house? Because it seemed to me that the house, the characters seem to move around the plot, whereas the house seems to take on a character of its own, and that seems much stronger than all the smaller characters together. But do you feel that? Was that your...
Yes, I do know where you're coming from that, and I have heard other people express a similar feeling for these books, and I think what's happened, of course, is it is the house that was obsessing me since being about 10 years old, and it's the house I was interested in, and it's the house that captured my imagination. So it is very, very important to my whole drive as a writer. I started with a house, and I wanted to live in it, and I wanted to sort of exist here in my imagination. So in a way, writing the books is an excuse for me to be here. Not actually quite literally, because the owner, Shane Lipscomb and Carol Lipscomb, are very kind. They will endlessly indulge me and let me come and poke around the house. And the manager, Nigel, is very kind. He will actually let me physically write in the house when we were having work done in our little farm. I couldn't think straight, so I was allowed to come here and write. And yes, I start with the house, with both books. I think more so with the first book, Shadow of Nanteos. I think very much the title expresses quite well the whole feel and atmosphere of the first book, because it's based on family, and the location is very much centred on the house, not just the wider estate. Yes, of course, we do go to Llanbadarn Church. We go to the town of Aberystwyth. There is one short scene in London, but actually I think if I was writing the book now, instead of 5 years ago, I would get rid of that scene. We don't need that scene. So the first book is quite claustrophobic, and very much the house overshadows everything in the book. The second book, I think people do escape from the clutches of the house. And maybe I, as a writer, have escaped from the clutches of the house a little bit, because of course we are out on a wider estate. So some of the characters in the book have never been to Nanteos, although very much
very much heard about it.
Yes.
Connected in one way or another.
Yes, and for instance, Branwen says towards the beginning of the book, oh, I would love to go to Nanteos, and of course she does go to Nanteos at one point, and there's a scene where she and another character, Davis, are on the ridge that runs where the road runs now, and then looking down at Nanteos, and it's like a ship in the night, like a fairy castle in the night with all the lights on. So, you know, even if people haven't been to Nanteos, of course, the tendrils of Nanteos, in terms of the Powell men, of course, were JPs and MPs, and they ran the poor law, and they administered local government as well as being at Westminster. So their tendrils came into everybody's life, even in the second book, even though they were state workers. So
yeah, that's one point as well. How do you negotiate the difficulty of not overloading the reader with too much information, but making sure the reader goes away satisfied? It must be quite hard because you know so much about it.
I think that's very hard. I think you've got to have a lot of disciplining. You've got to have a lot of self-discipline at the editing stage. And of course you do a tremendous amount of research, and that is the great pleasure. I really enjoy the research, but of course not everything belongs in the book, in the finished book. But I don't think actually that's a problem that only historical novelists have. Because my first book, The Geometry of Love, was essentially drawn from autobiography and biography. So you still have to, in any book, you still have to be disciplined about what you include and what you don't include. And you have to keep remembering the reader that A, the reader doesn't know what you know because they haven't been obsessed with the subject for 5 years. But secondly, that the reader doesn't have to know what you know.
No.
And the other thing that's very interesting, of course, is that you have to remember that the characters aren't interested in the things that you are interested in. They will completely take them as read because they lived in that time.
Yeah.
So what you as a writer find fascinating and you want to include, you have to make sure that you don't overgild it or raise it up too much, because of course it would have been just very ordinary.
Yeah.
So what I'm thinking, as an example, I found out during the course of my reading that there was rabies in Wales in the 18th century. Quite late on when writing, I was on the second draft of the book when I realised there was rabies in Wales. I was so interested in that. I did loads of research. It was in London and it was on the continent, and there's lots of diary entries and people writing about it. Fascinating. So I was desperate to find somewhere to put rabies in. But of course, I also had to, because it's my third book, The Dipping Pool, I did know I had to have some self-discipline. So it had to earn its place in the book, otherwise it can't be there.
Yeah.
So what I managed to use the rabies for, there's a scene in the book where there are two characters who've met before and they've established a relationship. It's an uneasy relationship, but the relationship is fairly finely balanced. Then they go to Machynlleth, and rabies is in Machynlleth, or maybe it was just a mad dog who was ill for another reason. We don't know, because obviously they had no way of proving that it was hydrophobia, as they called it. But the fact that everybody's panicked because of the rabies allows for an imbalance in the relationship, allows for panic, for adrenaline, and allows something to happen in the book because of that situation that possibly wouldn't have happened otherwise. And the other example I would give is lead mining, and how far lead mining just poisoned for miles around, and in fact still does. The lead from mines still poisons the water in this area of Wales. And it's very interesting. I read a lot about the effect on different animals of lead poisoning. And in fact, my cousin, who's about the same age as me, when he was a boy, they lived near where there was what was called a red mill near Cwmainion, which is where I set the dipping pool, and that they didn't know, but the ground there was poisoned, and he came out in boils, and the doctor said they kept their own cows and he drank the milk, and the doctor said you must stop drinking milk from your cows because there's the lead from the red mill. I mean, there was hardly anything but ruins there, but it's still in the soil and it's poisoning the pasture for the cow. So I wanted to use that. So again, I thought, okay, so how can I use that? So I used that in terms of Griffiths, the conjurer.
Yes, I thought that was very gently there.
I enjoyed using that. And of course, in the main character, Branwen, when she's searching around for some way to act, and she was sort of looking for some way in which to effect some sort of revenge. So I managed to put, the lead mining research that I'd done. Because I suppose, being only human, you spend a day or two doing this research and you make all these notes and you think, damn it, I've got to use it. So, but sometimes you just can't, and you just have to back off and say, well, I love knowing about that, but it doesn't belong in a finished book.
It must be very easy to get diverted and sidetracked and find yourself doing more research maybe than is necessary just because it's interesting.
Oh, absolutely. But that's the fun of it.
Yeah.
And I call that the dog in the wood. You go down the trail. And I think it's the process that I enjoy. I mean, I love having finished my book. I love readers' responses. It's very satisfying.
Do you allow a certain amount of time for your research, though? You must have to be fairly disciplined in that there's a time for publishing a book, presumably a time to go.
I'm not supposed to already. And in fact, I can't stop researching. And what's really irritating is 2 weeks after the book's published, you find something, you go, no, that would have been really great.
And where do you research? Do you research at the National Library or any particular place, or just?
Well, I would say everything is grist to the mill. I mean, I'm extremely lucky in that I live 9 miles away from the National Library of Wales, which has got a huge archive, not just generally about the history of Wales, but it's got the Gogevran papers, it's got Nanteos papers, so I can read letters written by characters that really existed that I'm writing about. Maps, objects, St Fagans, I've spent a lot of time in St Fagans. I do a lot of going to locations and just standing there and just being there. I read a lot of history books written about the 18th century and slightly earlier, because of course Wales in many ways was behind the curve in terms of things like fashions, in terms of literacy, that sort of thing. Many areas in England had sort of moved on in terms of vernacular architecture, etc. But another thing I find really, really interesting is reading anything from the time. So it's filtered through a historian writing about the time, and I find that tremendously interesting, and I do use that. But there's nothing like reading voices from the time, because they're not self-conscious. They're not aware that they're writing in 1750 and being read by somebody in the 21st century. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I guess the sort of pattern of the voices as well from that period, you must need to sort of pick up something from that.
I try to, but I decided very, very early on that I wasn't going to try and write authentic 18th century dialogue. For a start, I don't think I would have had to train myself for years to have the skill to do that. And secondly, of course, a lot of my characters are speaking Welsh. So I would have had to translate the original 18th century Welsh dialect from this area into English and then put it on the page, and it would have sounded very, very strange. And also, of course, the problem is people at that time, for the digging pool, there were a lot of ordinary people, mole catchers and hatters and ore carriers, etc. Centuries before the recording of their speech is possible. So the only way that their speech is ever recorded, really, because most of them are illiterate, is when they're in trouble, when they're in the court. And so somebody's scribing what they said in terms of testimony. But of course they were Welsh-speaking first language monoglot probably, and so somebody is transcribing it into English anyway. So I realised very, very early on that it was a hall of mirrors anyway, and that I could end up doing a PhD rather than writing a novel.
Yeah.
So my dialogue is...
You do drop a lot of Welsh into the text, and you don't explain what it means. You don't follow it by an explanation.
Yeah.
Are you assuming that a lot of your readers know it, or are you encouraging the ones that don't know to look it up?
Oh, that's a really good question. I suppose I'm a bit reckless as a writer, and that comes from... I might be a bit reckless as a person, but the recklessness can come from being a writer who doesn't receive an advance. So, I'm just small fry in terms of my publishing to date. So when I finish the book, my publisher will publish it, but there's nobody looking over my shoulder. So I tend to be able to take risks and change my book as I'm going along. So that's a risk I've taken, putting in the Welsh. I think it's less of a risk these days because if people who want to know, or if it's not clear in the context, people have got the internet now. So that wasn't available, say, 20 years ago to a reader. But I really like Cormac McCarthy. Do you know his work?
Yeah.
City of the Plain, The Crossing, All the Pretty Horses Blue Meridian. And sometimes he has whole pages in Spanish.
Yeah.
Now, I don't speak Spanish, but it's never put me off.
No.
And I guess, from the context, one always knows what's going on.
And if you drop the flow, then it's worse than...
Yeah, well, if I really wanted to know, I can scan in and Google it. So it is a risk I'm taking. Maybe had I got an editor with a big publishing house, you see, I wouldn't have been allowed to do that.
Yeah. Do you enjoy being with your characters? You must really sort of think yourself.
I love it.
Yeah.
In fact, that's why I wrote the two books, Nanteos books, because when I finished the first, I haven't finished. I wanted to go back. I wanted to come back to Nanteos. I wanted to come back thinking about the world of the 18th century. I had unfinished business, and yes, I really enjoy it. And I feel when I'm writing a scene and there's dialogue, my process as a writer is I imagine I'm in the room with them, and they're talking, and I'm writing down what they're saying. Because if I can't hear them, I can't really write dialogue. And if I can't see them, how can I make it real for my readers? Having said that, when you get towards the end of the book and the final editing process, sometimes you do have to write little connecting scenes that are just slog. So you just have to think, right, okay, so the reader needs to know this, and damn it, I haven't told them. So you have to take the reader from A to B, or X to Y, and you have to write a little scene which is purely created artificially and inserted in there as a bridge. But most of the book is about descriptions. I've imagined I'm there
and do you have a favourite when you're writing, or are they all exactly the same in your mind? Treat them all the same?
Yeah, well, no, you do have favourites. For instance, I like a lot of the minor characters actually. I really like the family. I like the animals. I would say they are like the houses, they are characters. For instance, the donkey and the swift and the bear. I liked writing the bear. I did a lot of research with that. I like Martha very much, and she's very important to both books, as is my family. But every single character, again, I don't feel I can write a character. Usually my characters, I've got some real person in mind. I don't do upset relationships, but nearly everybody, for instance Martha, I've got a very good friend in mind. Mary, I started off being bored with Mary, and as I started to write Mary, she was going to be really quite a small part, but as I wrote the book I got to really like her.
Yeah.
I prefer her now to Elizabeth, and although both of them are in the same bracket really, both of them as Mistress of Nanteos have got the same pressures acting on them, they react in such different ways. So I grew to really, really like Mary, and so I developed her part in the book. In fact, I brought her, after she left to leave Nanteos, I bring her back. She wasn't going to come back, but I brought her back because I liked her. I wanted to work with her again. It's almost a bit like, hiring an actor, come back and work with me. But yeah, I like The Conjurer a lot. I like Griffiths.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Do you have to educate the reader with your books? Do you think?
I don't think that's my first drive. I suppose my first drive was to share my obsession. But I think I'm trying to get the historical texture right. It does matter to me, and I know that in a way I'm on a losing wicket, because there's no way that I can bring to life, in terms of the virtual reality of the book, the 18th century. It's just black squiggles on a white page. So I know that I can't really bring these people to life. And I understood that when I wrote Geometry of Love, which is autobiographical. As soon as I started writing about real people and real events that had really happened, they sounded like fiction anyway. So I just I had to accept that as soon as you try and capture something with a black squiggle on a white page, it isn't in itself anyway.
Yeah.
It's filtered through language and your own psyche and your narrator.
Yeah.
And then of course the reader has to unpack it their end.
But it does give a good flavour of the time, of the period, and also the connection between London and here that was very strong still, wasn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
I think we're coming to the end, so...
Yes. Yeah, everybody's waving. And
Yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. And
Thank you. It's been very good.
I've talked to you for about 5 hours instead.
Yes, it's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for spending the time. And